My name is Wyatt Brennan. I'm 33 years old, and I run a small woodworking shop in a quiet town in the hills of North Carolina. I build furniture, mostly tables, chairs, rocking cradles for families expecting their first child. It's slow work, the kind that doesn't make a man rich, but there's something honest about it. You can run your hand over a thing you made and know it'll outlast you. My father taught me the trade before his hands gave out, and when he passed 4 years ago, the shop became the only place in the world that still felt like home. I'd mostly given up on the idea of meeting someone, not out of bitterness. I just figured a man who spends his days covered in sawdust, who'd rather listen than talk, wasn't the kind of person who got noticed. The women I'd known always seemed to want more noise, more flash, more certainty than I had to offer. So I poured myself into the work and told myself that was enough. Most days, I believed it. Then Grace Donnelly walked into my shop on a Tuesday morning to order a dining table for her mother's birthday. She wasn't what I expected. She asked real questions, the kind that told me she actually cared how a thing was made. She ran her fingers along the grain of a walnut board the way I did, like she could feel the years in it. We talked for almost an hour about a table that should have taken 5 minutes to order. When she finally left, the shop felt quieter than it had in years, and I realized I was already hoping she'd find a reason to come back. She did. She came back the next week to check on the progress, even though I'd told her it would take a month. Then she came back the week after that. We started having coffee at the little diner down the road. Then, dinners. Then, long evenings on the porch of my shop, where neither of us wanted to be the first to say goodnight. But there was something underneath it all, a carefulness in her. Every time things got close, she'd pull back a half step, like she was waiting for the floor to give out. One night, sitting on that porch with the crickets going and the last of the light gone from the hills, I finally asked her why. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said it, looking down at her hands. My dad said I'd never find a good man. He said I always pick the ones who leave, that I'm too much or not enough, and that one day I'd understand he was just trying to protect me. She gave a small, broken laugh. I've spent my whole life believing him. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I didn't make a speech about it. I just looked at this woman who'd been carrying someone else's doubt like it was the truth, and I said the only thing that made sense to me. Then, I'd like to meet him. She stared at me like I'd said something in another language. And what happened when I drove up to that old farmhouse to face the man who'd spent 29 years teaching his daughter she was unlovable would end up changing not just her life, but mine, and his, in ways none of us saw coming. Grace didn't answer me right away. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, the way she did when she was deciding how much of herself was safe to show. The crickets filled the silence between us. "You don't understand," she finally said. "My dad isn't some monster you can just talk down. He's not cruel. That's the thing. He's not a bad man. He's just always been sure. About everything. About me. And being sure for 30 years, that does something to a person. To both of us." "Tell me about him," I said. So she did. Her father was a man named Hank Donnelly. He'd run a dairy farm up in the next county for most of his life, the same farm his own father had run before him. Grace's mother, Eleanor, was the gentle one, the one who softened Hank's edges. But the way Grace told it, her father had spent his whole life expecting the worst, so he'd never be caught off guard by it. He'd watched the farm nearly go under twice. He'd buried his own father young. He'd learned, somewhere along the way, that the world took things from you, and the only protection was to never let yourself believe too hard in anything good. And he'd raised his daughter the same way. "When I was 16, Grace said, I had this boyfriend, Tommy, first real one. And my dad sat me down and told me Tommy would leave, that boys like that always do, that I shouldn't get my hopes up. And you know what? Tommy did leave. Moved away that summer. Broke my heart. And my dad just looked at me with this expression that said, 'I told you so.' He didn't even have to say it out loud." She rested her chin on her knees. "It happened again in college. And again after that. Every man I ever cared about, my dad said it wouldn't last. And every time, it didn't. After a while, I stopped being able to tell whether he was right about the world or whether I was just making his words come true. Whether I'd started picking men who'd leave because some part of me needed to prove he was right, or needed to prove him wrong and kept failing. I thought about that for a long moment. About how a thing said often enough stops being a warning and becomes a blueprint. "Grace," I said carefully, "I'm not Tommy. And I'm not the others. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at me with eyes that wanted to believe me and were terrified too. That's what they all say at the start, Wyatt. Every single one of them said something like that. And then, the moment things got hard, they were gone. My dad's voice was always there in the back of my head, going, see, this is what happens. She shook her head. I don't think I can do it again. I don't think I can hand someone my whole heart and watch it prove him right one more time. That's when I understood what I was really up against. It wasn't Hank Donnelly, 60-some years old on a dairy farm in the next county. It was 30 years of a quiet voice teaching a little girl that love was a thing that always left. And you don't argue a voice like that out of someone's head with a speech on a porch. You have to outlast it. You have to show up so many times that a new voice starts to grow alongside the old one. I meant what I said, I told her. I'd like to meet your dad. Not to fight him, not to prove anything. I just think if he's the voice in your head, then he should at least get a look at the man you're scared to believe in. Let him say his piece to my face, instead of from inside your memory. He'll tear you apart, she whispered. Maybe, I said. But I've been torn apart before, and I'm still here. She almost smiled at that. Almost. It took her 2 weeks to agree. 2 weeks of me showing up, steady, not pushing, just being where I said I'd be when I said I'd be there. Coffee on Tuesdays, dinner on Fridays. A phone call every night, not to ask for anything, just to say goodnight. I think that's what finally did it. Not anything I said, but the fact that I kept doing the small things long after most men would have gotten tired of waiting for her to feel safe. She called me on a Sunday night. Okay, she said. Sunday dinner. Next week. My parents do it every week. Come. But Wyatt, I need you to know what you're walking into. My dad isn't going to make this easy. He's going to test you. He's going to say things to get a reaction. It's what he does. It's how he figures out what a man is made of. Then I'll let him figure it out, I said. The drive up to the Donnelly farm took about 40 minutes, winding up into the hills where the road turned to gravel and the pastures opened up green on either side. The farmhouse was old but well kept. White clapboard with a wraparound porch and a barn out back that had clearly been patched and repainted more times than anyone could count. A man who took care of his things. A man who stayed. Grace's hands were shaking on the drive. I reached over and held one of them. Whatever happens in there, I said, I'm leaving with you. Not because I proved anything, just because I want to. Hank Donnelly was waiting on the porch when we pulled up. He was a big man gone solid with age, gray hair under a worn cap, forearms like a man who'd spent 60 years doing real work. He watched me get out of the truck with eyes that didn't miss anything. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just looked at me the way you look at a board you're deciding whether to build with or throw on the burn pile. You the woodworker, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. Wyatt Brennan. He didn't shake my hand. He just nodded once toward the door. Eleanor's got dinner about ready. Come on. Then, Grace's mother, Eleanor, was everything Grace had described. Warm, quick to smile, the kind of woman who set an extra place at the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. She hugged her daughter tight and then hugged me too, surprising me, and whispered, I'm so glad you came, in my ear before letting go. Dinner was tense from the first minute. Hank sat at the head of the table and asked me questions that were really tests, exactly the way Grace had warned. How much money did a woodworking shop bring in? Not much, I admitted, but enough. Did I own the building or rent it? Owned it, free and clear, left to me by my father. What did I think a man's job was in a marriage? I said I thought it was to show up, every day, especially the hard ones. Hank's eyes flickered at that, just for a second. A lot of men say that, he said. Showing up's easy when things are good. You find out what a man's made of when the cattle get sick and the bank's calling and the roof's leaking and there's no money to fix it. That's when men leave. I've seen it my whole life. Good times don't test anybody. I agree with you, I said. That seemed to throw him. He'd been expecting an argument. You agree? Yes, sir. I think you're right that good times don't test a man. I lost my father 4 years ago, watched him go slow, watched his hands stop working before the rest of him did. I ran that shop alone through the worst year of my life, so I know a little about the hard days you're talking about. And I didn't leave. I'm still there. The table went quiet. Grace was staring at her plate. Eleanor had gone still, watching her husband. Hank set down his fork. Grace tells me you want to marry her. I hadn't said that to anyone. Not even to Grace. I looked at her, and she looked as surprised as I felt. But I realized, sitting at that table, that it was true. It had been true for a while. I haven't asked her yet, I said. I wanted to meet you first. But yes, sir, I'd like to. If she'll have me, and if you'll let me. And why? Hank said, his voice hard now, leaning forward. Would I let some sawdust-covered furniture maker take my only daughter when I've watched 4 other men make her promises and break her heart? You think you're different? They all thought they were different. This was the moment Grace had warned me about, the tearing apart. I could feel her bracing beside me, waiting for me to either fight back or fold, and either one would prove the voice in her head right. So, I did neither. Mr. Donnelly, I said quietly. I don't think I'm different. I think I'm just the one who's still here. I can't promise you I'm special. I can't promise you I won't ever make a mistake. But I can tell you that every time the world's tried to teach me that good things leave, I've decided to stay anyway. And I think you know something about that. I think you've stayed your whole life on this farm, with this family, through things that would have broken most men. I'm not asking you to believe I'm worthy of her. I'm asking you to let me prove it the same way you proved it, by showing up, for as long as it takes. Hank stared at me. For a long, long moment, nobody at that table breathed. Then something happened that I don't think Grace had ever seen. Her father's eyes went wet. He looked away, fast, out the window toward the barn, his jaw working. You don't know what you're asking, he said, and his voice had changed. The hardness had cracked, and underneath it was something old and tired and afraid. You don't know what it's like to love something so much you'd rather it never happened than watch it get taken from you. To look at your little girl and know the world's going to hurt her, and you can't stop it. You can't stop any of it, so the only thing you can do is try to make her ready. Try to make her tough enough that it won't kill her when it comes. And there it was. 30 years of a father's doubt, and underneath it, the thing it had always really been. Not cruelty. Fear. A man so terrified of his daughter being hurt that he'd spent her whole life trying to lower her hopes to a height he thought she could survive falling from. Dad, Grace said. Her voice broke on the word. Hank turned to look at her, and I watched a lifetime pass between them. I thought I was protecting you, he said. I thought I was being a good father. He shook his head slowly. But I made you believe you weren't worth staying for. Didn't I? I see it now. Looking at you sitting there scared to death this man's going to be like the others. I did that, not them. Me. I'm the one who taught you that. The room was completely silent. Eleanor had tears running down her face. She reached over and put her hand on her husband's arm, and I got the feeling she'd been waiting 30 years to hear him say this. Grace was crying openly now. I spent my whole life trying to prove you wrong, she said, or prove you right. I don't even know anymore. Every time someone got close, I'd hear your voice telling me it wouldn't last, and I'd push them away before they could leave, and then I'd think, see? Dad was right, nobody stays. I did it to myself because you taught me to expect it. I know, Hank said. God help me. I know. I sat there, not saying anything, because this wasn't my moment. This was 30 years finally breaking open, and the best thing I could do was let it. Hank wiped his face with the back of his big hand and turned to me. And when he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost gentle. You really gonna stay, he said. When it gets hard, when she pushes you away, because she will, she's gonna test you worse than I ever could. She's gonna try to make you leave just to get it over with. You gonna stay through that? Yes, sir, I said. I am. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood up, came around the table, and held out his hand. I stood and took it. His grip was iron, the grip of a man who'd worked his whole life, and he held on a second longer than a handshake needed. Then you're a better man than I was, he said. Because I spent 30 years teaching my girl to expect the worst, and you just walked in here and taught her something I never could. Took me till I was 63 to learn it. His voice caught. Don't make me regret this, son. I won't, I said. We didn't get engaged that night. That came later, on the porch of my shop, with a ring I'd carved a wooden box for, because that's the kind of man I am. But the real thing, the thing that actually changed everything, happened at that dinner table. Because Grace didn't just get a man who'd stay. She got her father back, the real one. The one who'd been buried under all that fear for so long that even he'd forgotten he was in there. The months after that weren't a fairy tale. Grace had warned me, and she was right about herself. There were nights she pushed me away. Nights the old voice got loud in her head, and she tried to end things before I could, tried to prove the prophecy true one last time. One night, about 2 months in, She stood in my shop and told me she thought we should stop, that she was too broken, that I'd be better off with someone who didn't come with 30 years of damage. I just kept sweeping the floor. Okay, I said. You can think that, but I'm still going to be here tomorrow. And the day after. So you let me know when you're done trying to make me leave, because it's not going to work. She broke down crying, and I held her. And she said, "Why won't you go?" Everyone else went. And I said, "Because I'm not everyone else. I'm the one who stays. You're going to get tired of trying to prove me wrong." And eventually, she did. Not all at once, but slowly, the old voice got quieter, and a new one grew up beside it. One that sounded a little like me, and a little like the father she'd gotten back. And most of all, finally, like herself. Hank came around in ways I never expected. He started showing up at the shop on Saturdays just to sit and watch me work, the way he must have watched his own father once. He didn't say much, but one afternoon, running his hand over a cradle I was building for a young couple in town, he said, "My dad made one of these." For me, I always meant to learn how. Never did. And I handed him a chisel and showed him, and we spent the whole afternoon working on it together. Two quiet men who'd both learned the hard way that staying was a thing you chose every single day. We got married the following spring, in the pasture behind the Donnelly farm, under a sky so blue it didn't look real. Eleanor cried the whole time. Hank walked Grace down the aisle, and when he handed her to me, he held onto both our hands for a second and said, low enough that only we could hear. I was wrong about everything, except one thing. I always said she deserved a good man. He looked at me. Turns out, I just didn't know what one looked like until he showed up at my dinner table and refused to argue with me. In my vows, I told Grace that I'd spent my life building things that outlast the people who make them. Tables that get passed down. Cradles that hold one baby and then another and another. And that I wanted to build a life with her the same way. Slow. Honest. Made to last. Something she could run her hand over in 50 years and know it had held. In hers, Grace told me that she'd come to me believing she was someone who would always be left. That her own father had taught her she wasn't worth staying for, and she'd spent 30 years making it come true. And that I'd done the one thing nobody else ever had. I'd just stayed. Quietly, stubbornly, refusing to leave even when she tried to make me. And somewhere in all that staying, she'd finally started to believe she was worth it. Hank's still got his cap and his hard edges and his way of expecting the worst. Some things don't change at 63. But he's softer now, in the ways that matter. He holds his grandchildren, 2 of them now, like they're made of glass and gold both. And sometimes I catch him telling them things. Good things. You're going to do wonderful in this world. People are going to love you. Don't you ever let anybody, including your old grandpa, tell you that you're not worth staying for. I think it's his way of making up for it. For the 30 years he spent teaching his daughter the opposite. And every time I hear him say it, I see Grace go still and listen, like a little girl finally hearing the words she needed her whole life. These days my shop is full and warm, and there's a little wooden box on the windowsill, the one I carved for Grace's ring, except now it holds her wedding band when she's working in the garden so it doesn't get dirty. And on quiet evenings, when the work is done and the kids are asleep and Grace is sitting on the porch of the shop where it all started, I think about that dinner, about a hard old man who'd buried his love under 30 years of fear. About 4 words that walked me straight into the lion's den. She said her dad told her she'd never find a good man. So I asked to meet him. And it turned out the thing that finally set her free wasn't me beating her father, or proving him wrong, or winning some argument at a dinner table. It was watching the 2 of them find their way back to each other. Because the voice in her head was never really about whether she could be loved by a stranger. It was about whether she'd ever been loved by the one man who was supposed to love her first. She had been. All along. He'd just been too afraid to show it in any way, except trying to make her tough enough to survive a world he was sure would break her heart. I didn't fix Grace. I didn't rescue her. I just stood close enough, long enough, that she and her father could finally hear each other over the noise of all those years. And in the staying, all 3 of us found something we'd each given up on in our own quiet ways. A good man, it turns out, isn't the one who has all the answers, or the money, or the certainty. He's just the one who's still there in the morning. The one who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. That's all I ever was. And somehow, for Grace, for Hank, for me, it turned out to be enough. It turned out to be everything.